Well, good morning to all of you in Cornerstone Church. Let's turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2. And we finished off last week when we looked at this particular chapter with the story of the opposition beginning to build against Nehemiah. And when a man of God or a woman of God seeks to rise up and serve the Lord, there'll always be opposition. There'll always be something that annoys the devil and his crowd. And God always has his man and his plan. But on the other side, the devil will always have his man and his plan. And never assume when you're walking in the will of the Lord that there'll be no opposition. In fact, the very opposite. Whenever you're serving the Lord, there'll always be opposition. And knowing that the opposition exists and is there does not intimidate this man Nehemiah. Nehemiah, if you remember, lived in Persia in a powerful position in the court of the king of Persia. And no doubt many would have said there's no hope for him to ever leave such a position. He's a captive. He's a servant, a very trusted and powerful servant of King Artaxerxes. But yet we discover in this story that God, in a most miraculous way, opened the door providentially for this man, Nehemiah, to have an opportunity to speak to King Artaxerxes. And the king, who normally asked people to do this for him or that for him, does something remarkable. He asks Nehemiah, "What can I do for you?" And Nehemiah is given this golden opportunity to make this request to the king. And he takes the opportunity we saw in chapter 2 last time. And Nehemiah is not to be denied in serving the Lord here down in Jerusalem. But even at this very early stage, the Holy Spirit is letting us know in verse 10 that the devil is watching. And it says, verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant an Ammonite heard of it, just heard about it, it grieved them exceedingly. And any time the work of God goes forward, the devil is upset. The devil is angered. The devil and his crowd are grieved. And the devil and his crowd will then begin to stir up trouble for the people of God. Now, verse 11 jumps 1,500 miles later, 2 to 3 months later, because in verse 11 of chapter 2, it says, so I came to Jerusalem. So he's left the palace in Persia. He's made this long, arduous, and dangerous journey back to the ancient homeland of his people. And we can imagine this is the very first time that Nehemiah has ever been in the land of Israel, his forefathers. We can imagine the excitement. We can imagine the emotional attachment. We can imagine the thankfulness in his heart as he walks in the Holy Land for the very first time. I remember the first time that I saw Jerusalem. We were coming up the bus from the side of the valley, and as we were approaching on the bus, the coach driver played that wonderful anthem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. The song's called The Holy City, and as we saw Jerusalem for the first time, what an emotional feeling for the child of God when you see Jerusalem for the very first time. But how much more must it be for a Jew who has been out of his ancient homeland for over 100 years, his family, and then to see it, the holy city, the promised city, for the very first time. And Nehemiah, we're not told anything about the journey. It just jumps from Persia to Jerusalem in a matter of a few verses. Now, a number of great problems now consults Nehemiah. He had problems in Persia. problems in getting permission to go to Jerusalem, problems in asking the king's help to go to Jerusalem, and then getting there. So he had come through 3 or 4 great obstacles already by faith. But now when he arrives there, problems are only going to increase. And that's always the same in the work of God. When one problem is dealt with, when one difficulty is handled, whether in the home, whether in the church, whether even in the workplace, there's another one coming. And life is full of tests for the child of God. Every step in the journey of life consists of test of our faith upon test. If you remember Daniel, in the book of Daniel, when we first meet him, faced a great trial of his faith as a teenager, whether to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine, which was offered up for idols. And Daniel said, no, I'm not going to pollute myself. I'm not going to contaminate my testimony, mar my testimony by doing what God forbids. And that was a tremendous test of his character and his faith at just a young age. But then as we go through the life of Daniel, we discover the tests just keep coming and the problems just keep coming. And by the time he's in his 80s in Daniel chapter 6, he faces the greatest test of them all. When the king orders that no one is to pray to any other god for 30 days, except to the king himself. And Daniel was told, if you break that law, you will be cast into the den of lions, to be torn apart in the most cruel, barbaric, and inhumane form. And yet what does Daniel do? He faces the test well. He honors God over the king's commandment. And all through Daniel's life is test upon test upon test. In fact, we could almost say this, the tests get harder the more mature he becomes, spiritually and physically. And here Nehemiah has faced a number of problems just to get to Jerusalem. But now he's at Jerusalem. The problems will not just continue, they will multiply for this man Nehemiah. And we'll discover the first great problem is the wall itself is in ruins. There's a great physical problem to handle. Then there's this emotional problem of having to find a way to encourage the people, gather the people, compel the people to do the rebuilding of the walls. And remember, he's a rich foreigner, powerful foreigner. And it's not going to be easy for him coming in as an outsider to speak to those who've been in the holy city for at least a generation and say to them, listen, you need to get to work and you need to do it now. And no doubt many of them would resent a man of privilege and power like him coming from abroad in his fancy Persian clothes, and they would say, who are you to talk to us? You've had a good life, an easy life, and you don't have the problems we have of bringing up a family, trying to farm the land here and face these hostile foes, and here you are lecturing us. And he knows that the people are inert and discouraged, and it's not going to be easy. In fact, they have a history of defeat. These walls have been broken down for now 140 years. That's going to be a difficult thing for Nehemiah to persuade these people to rebuild this wall. The walls are completely destroyed. It's going to be no easy task to even locate all the stones, clean all the stones, then transport them, then shape them, and then put them together. And these people are having to, at the same time, make a living for their families. And there's going to be opposition. There's going to be difficulty. There's going to be problems. And yet, despite all these obstacles, and I forgot to mention the spiritual opposition, there's going to be the enemies opposing him from within, the Jews, and from without, from the likes of Sanballat and Tobiah and the devil working through all these powerful enemies. Now remember, these enemies were not insignificant people. They were powerful people. And Nehemiah is going to have to face them down. This is going to be a spiritual war, as well as a physical and an emotional battle for him to face. And the amazing thing, if I can just say this by way of an overview, despite all the obstacles of history, the emotional obstacles, the physical obstacles, the spiritual obstacles, what we'll discover in this story is by the grace of God, by the help of God, by the intervention of God, Nehemiah and his co-workers will be able to rebuild these walls in just 52 days. A most remarkable thing. Now, how does he do it? How did the impossible, or the seemingly impossible, become possible? Well, you'll discover that Nehemiah had a vision for God. He had a vision from God. And he had a vision for God's glory in this matter. And he had prepared his heart. He had prepared his mind for this battle. He didn't come into it lightly. He came into it spiritually ready. Number two, you will discover that Nehemiah was a man of prayer. We've seen that already. A man who knew God, a man who leant on God when difficulties came. He was constantly in communion with God. Number three, Nehemiah, you'll discover, was a man who personally was willing to sacrifice. He was a man who could lead from the front. One of the reasons King David was such a successful king, in fact, we were understating it. The reason King David was not just a successful king, but Israel's greatest king, and always succeeded in war, was that David was a man who knew God, man of prayer, man in touch with God. But number two, David was a man who led from the front. When King Saul and his soldiers, including Abner, saw Goliath coming, they all ran away, but not David. And even though he was a relative youth, inexperienced in war, David, as soon as he saw the great Philistine champion, he said, I'll fight him. And he not only said it, he did it. And he conquered Goliath. And then David took over Saul's army and he led from the front, went to war against the Philistines, and he put his life on the line. And all through the 40 years he was king, David was always a man who, when there was a battle, when there was trouble, he never ran away. He always said, I'll go, and I'll go first. And whatever it costs, I'll pay the price. And that inspired others. And that was something that led to other men saying, if that young man can do it, I'm going to be with him. I'm going to stand with him. And David will lead from the front. But then you'll notice something else about Nehemiah. He was always a man who was consumed with this great thought, to God be the glory. He's always trying to give God the glory. Remember in verse 8 of chapter 2, after all the things that he had gone through, all the obstacles, to get to the point of making his way to Jerusalem, he said, the king granted me all of these requests. And then he said at the end of verse 8, according to the good hand of my God upon me. It's all about God, he says. It's all about God's glory. It's all about God's help. And Nehemiah was a man who was consumed with that all the way through his life and his ministry. But another great quality we're going to see, particularly in this chapter and in this incident, was that Nehemiah was a man of prayer, yes, a man of courage, a man of action, a man who cared for others, a man who had a vision for God's glory, had a vision for God and knew God. Nehemiah was also a man who planned. He wasn't never rash. He was always very careful to think through all the details that he possibly could before he made a step forward. And this quality is to be seen not in opposition to God's sovereignty. In fact, you go through the Bible, you go through church history, and you'll discover those who had the greatest trust in the sovereignty of God, the power of God, were men and women who took time to carefully plan in light of God's sovereignty. If you remember Joshua before he went into the promised land and how God promised him, I'll be with you and I'll bring you into this land and I'll enable you to defeat all your enemies. What did he do? He sent out the 2 spies to Rahab's house. And planning and trusting in God's promises and God's providence go hand in hand. And we should never negate one in line of the other. We shouldn't be people who just plan and ignore God's providence. But on the other hand, we must always plan and trust God's providence in one hand and the other. And you'll see here, he doesn't rush out, Nehemiah, when he arrives in Jerusalem and say to all the Jewish people there, Nehemiah, the great officer of King Artaxerxes, has arrived. Nehemiah, the great leader, is here. Nehemiah, the great Persian and friend of the king, is here. He doesn't go out and boast about his power or his influence, nor does he arrive and say, well, we've been 140 years without a wall. I am here with the plan. I'm here with all the ideas. And you just follow me and trust me and everything will be okay. And Nehemiah shows you and I that patience and planning and waiting on God are very important things. We saw that with Ezra, was a man who was very careful to be still and know that I am God. Never to run ahead of God. Always careful to wait and follow God's leading. And of course, that was very difficult for Nehemiah. He's a man of action. He's a man who's emotional in arriving in Jerusalem for the very first time. He sees the great need. But before Nehemiah calls the people to work, before he unfolds the great plan of action, notice how carefully he takes time to formulate the plan and to think through the details. In verse 12 it says, after the 3 days, it says, I arose in the night, I and some few men with me. So he doesn't go during the daytime when he could be influenced by others. No doubt there were people when they saw this powerful, cultured Persian arriving from the land of Persia with all the authority of King Artaxerxes. They would have seen the opportunity to enrich themselves, to ingratiate themselves with him. And Nehemiah, being a very shrewd and wise man, he wants to check the details for himself. And it's always very important you do that. That you don't simply rely on the testimony of others. Because no matter how trusting we can be of others, we always must remind ourselves they could be wrong. Or they could have other motives. And what they say may be tainted by corruption of sin and sinful ideas and sinful motives. And Nehemiah is going to be very, very careful. He doesn't come there and reveal all what he's going to do. In fact, it says in verse 12, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. Now there's a lesson there for all of us. Before you talk big, and there are times when you have to talk big and tell others, this is the plan, this is the way that the Lord has led. Don't speak until you have to speak. Keep your lips sealed. And that's difficult for us because as people, we like to talk. We like others to respect us. We like others to look up to us. And it's very, very hard sometimes just to keep quiet and to make sure you have checked everything through carefully first. And that's a great a lesson for us to learn in schools, in universities. Just go there and listen before you speak. In church meetings, in church contexts, in the workplace, in the home. Sit and evaluate carefully. Listen, observe carefully before you speak, and make sure you audit everything yourself carefully. Don't just simply rely on others. By all means, ask others. By all means, question others. By all means, read the opinions of others. But don't make the mistake of not checking it for yourself when the opportunity is there. Don't be lazy. Even King David made a mistake, it seems, with Mephibosheth after he was restored to the monarchy again, after Absalom had led the rebellion against him. And Shimei and others lied to David. And David wasn't careful to check it out and to do an honest audit of what had been said or alleged about Mephibosheth. And that was wrong by David, in my opinion. And you and I have to be careful, check things through carefully. And Nehemiah, he doesn't just rely on other people. He gets up and he goes carefully through all the detail. And what he's doing is he's preparing himself for any potential objection, so that when people ask him questions or raise objections the next day, and he knows he's going to face the leaders of the Jewish people as well as the people themselves. And there's going to be a long list of problems, and he wants to make sure he is fully prepared as best he can be for those objections. And he doesn't want to present a pipe dream to the Jewish people in Jerusalem. He wants to present a plan that he has thought through prayerfully and carefully and is based on facts, not simply feelings. And he knows that the people, particularly the ordinary people, will be skeptical of this rich, cultured outsider. I mean, how many walls has Nehemiah built? He's never been there before. He's not a builder. He's the king's cupbearer. And when he gets up in his fine robes and his cultured Persian accent and language, people are going to say, well, who are you to tell us what to do? And what experience have you, Nehemiah, in matters such as this? And even though he carries respect and authority as the king's cupbearer, Nehemiah wants to be known as a man who knows what he's talking about. And that's so important, so very important. Now, Nehemiah is, you should note as well, he goes through everything he can in the time available. You can't know every piece of information. If you wait until you have every detail in life before you make a decision, you'll never do anything. Sometimes I tell young people this about looking for a life partner. If you wait until you know everything about that person, number one, you'll never reach that point because you can never see into the hearts and minds of another person. But if you wait until you've checked every box or ticked every box about what you know about them and their background and the way they conduct themselves in different aspects of life, you'll never get married. You'll never even date someone. Because you're demanding information that's impossible for you to accumulate about that person. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't look for information. You shouldn't check for certain details. And Nehemiah knows here, he doesn't know, he will not be able to know every detail of every brick of every person who lives in Jerusalem. But what he's doing here is he's taking the time that is available and checking what he can in that time. And he's trying to make sure he does cover all the big things, the big tick items. And he's trusting God for the rest. And it says in verse 13, and I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down. And then it says, then I went on to the gate of the fountain, verse 14, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then verse 15, then went I up in the night by the brook and viewed the wall and turned back and entered by the gate of the valley and so returned. So he did a comprehensive audit or check before he even formulated his plan. And there's great wisdom in that. And verse 16 says, and the rulers knew not whether I went or what I did. Neither had I as yet told it to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. So he's very, very careful not to reveal what he's going to do until he's done a thorough audit. And he's also careful not to talk to groups, because Nehemiah is aware, a man of power and experience, that if you start revealing information to one particular group of people, then there's a possibility that you lose the confidence of the rest. You're seen as controlled by them. Reminds me the story of G. Campbell Morgan, the great Bible teacher of the early 20th century in England. And he was asked by the richest man in the world at that time to come and pastor a church in New York City. And the man, Rockefeller, said to him, listen, if you come, I will ensure that you have a church building that will be the finest evangelical church in all the world. And I'll ensure that all the bills are paid for if you come and pastor this church in New York City where I live, so that I can attend it. Now, many people would have been excited by such an offer, would have been thrilled and honored and flattered by such an offer. And G. Campbell Morgan didn't dismiss it immediately, but he thought about it carefully. And then he wrote a letter to Rockefeller. And he said, I'm going to have to decline your offer. Rockefeller wrote back and said, well, why? Was there something wrong? Was there not enough promises made to you? Did I not underwrite everything? Is there something more that you need from me in order to take this position? And G. Campbell Morgan sent another letter back and he said this, it's very, very simple. He said to Mr. Rockefeller, I'm very honored, very grateful with the offer. But my concern is this. If I go to New York City under the terms that you have outlined, then everybody will see me as Rockefeller's pastor rather than God's pastor, God's man. And that I cannot do. And you know, he was so right, wasn't he? So wise in his analysis, because if he had gone, everybody would have said, that man's controlled by this powerful group of a family, the Rockefeller family. And he dare not speak out against him. He dare not touch sins in their lives because he's their man, he's their pastor. And you know, Nehemiah here, he understood that if he was to reveal too much too quickly, that rumors could start. If he was to align himself, even with the best of motives, with one group or another, that it would be misunderstood. And he's very careful not to say a thing. But then in verse 17, having done all the preparation, the praying and the preparation, there now comes the time to reveal the plan. And you know, there are a lot of people who never get to verse 17 in life. If you talk to older folk, many of them will tell you, I wish I had done this or that in my life. And even pastors will tell you this. I wish I had done A or B or C. And they said, I had all these plans and I thought it through all so carefully. And then you say, well, why didn't you do it? And I thought, well, in the end, I just lacked the courage or the initiative to go ahead and do it. And I wish I hadn't. I wish I had invested there. I wish I had gone to that place. I wish I had gone through with this idea, because it would have completely changed my future and the future of others. And Nehemiah is not going to be like that. He's not going to be someone who will look back on life with hindsight with what ifs. He's a man who will pray, plan, and then act. And verse 17, he gathers the people and he says, ye see the distress that we are in. Now, Notice how he addresses these people. Notice the pronouns he uses. It would be very easy for Nehemiah as an outsider, having never been there before, to turn up and say, we see the problem you are in. It'd be very easy for Nehemiah to scold, even by way of implication, those in Jerusalem for not rebuilding the walls. But he doesn't. He's very careful with his words. He says, ye see the distress that we are in. He identifies with them in their problems. He doesn't take the opportunity to put one over on them, to make himself look grand and different from them. And he says, not only that we are in, and the gates thereof are burned with fire, and then he says this, and let us, he includes himself, build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach. Nehemiah lets them know right at the very beginning, I identify with the problem. I'm with you in this situation, and I'm going to work with you to solve it. Now that's a wonderful pattern for you and I to follow. As parents, grandparents, as church leaders, church members, in the workplace, whenever there's a problem, whenever you see a situation, don't go in and begin to simply tear holes or tear strips of those and point out all the flaws. If it's your family, it's your family. If it's your church, you're part of the church of Jesus Christ. Go there and identify and say, I can see the problem. We're all in here. And I've thought through carefully the issues, and let's solve them together. Let's work together as a team. And let's get this matter resolved. And it's amazing what people will do when they see that you are with them, that you identify with them, that you care for them, that you're not trying to lord over them and put them down and patronize them. And Nehemiah, he's a master communicator, I have to say. He's an inspirational man. And the reason he's able to get the people to rise up after 140 years of failure and complete this task is because he is a humble man. He's a gracious man. And he's a man who's willing to set the example. He's not a people pleaser, Nehemiah, but he is a people encourager. And I love this about this man. And he doesn't hide the reproach. He's direct. He says, you see the distress that we're in. He doesn't cover up. He doesn't pretend there's not a problem. He tells them there is a problem. But it's a problem for us all, including me. But it's a problem we can solve. And there are a lot of Christians, and they tell you about the problem, but they can't tell you how to solve the problem. Or if they can tell you, they just don't want to. They just want to come in and machine gun down the person and say, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you've done this, and then walk away and leave them. And they feel, well, I've done my job. No, you haven't. I often use the illustration of a doctor. If you were to go to see the GP and the GP tells you you have a particular symptom and disease and diagnoses from the symptom and that what the root cause is. And then if the doctor was to say, well, my time's up now, I need to go for lunch, goodbye. Next patient, please. You'd say, well, that doctor's not very good, because not only does he just simply identify the problem, but he doesn't tell me how to solve it. And he doesn't seem to have any care for me. He doesn't seem to want to help me in this situation. And Nehemiah's not like that. He's a man who cares, but he's a man who confronts the issue, but then he's a man who has a solution to the issue. And he wants to work with the Jewish people to do this. And leadership, whether in the home, the church, or the workplace, is about example. It's about setting the right example. It's about leading from the front. And I mentioned earlier King David, why he was the greatest king in the history of his nation. He always led by example. He never ran away. Even Daniel, we saw, when the challenges came, what did he do? He set the example. He says, I won't take of the king's meat. I won't take of the king's wine. When the challenge came about praying 3 times a day, Daniel says, I'm going to pray. I'm not going to back down. I'm always going to set the right example. But then in verse 18, he says, then I told them of the hand of my God which was good upon me. You see, you'll never inspire people simply by clever words about your abilities, because people are very quick to spot the weaknesses in your character and the flaws in your character. And the only way to really encourage people to look beyond your weaknesses is to direct their attention to the strength of God and the power of God. And he does this really carefully. He says, then I told them of the hand of my God which was good upon me. Oh, he said, I give God the glory. I made sure they understood that the secret to the success of Nehemiah, the secret to the success of Ezra, the secret to success of Zerubbabel, the secret to success of King David and Moses and Joshua and all our forefathers was not them, but the God who empowered them, the God whose hand was upon them. And he puts the emphasis upon God and God's power and God's guidance and God's help. And then he says in verse 18, and they said, oh, see how they respond now. Once they hear of the hand of God, once he has taken their attention away from their circumstances, away from their failures, and away even from the weaknesses of Nehemiah, the frailties of Nehemiah, and put the emphasis on God and his power, and testifies of how God does this. God rewards Nehemiah's faith, Nehemiah's wisdom, because at the end of verse 13 it says, and they said, unsolicited, unified. It says, they said in verse 18, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. 140 years of failure. 140 years where it seemed that nobody could solve this riddle. And yet Nehemiah solved it by planning properly, by setting the right example, and by directing the people to the Lord. Now, the devil is also watching. In verse 19, but, when you see that, the Bible is drawing the contrast between God's men, God's work, and the devil's men and the devil's work. But when Sanballat, and you're going to run into the Sanballats in your life. You're going to run into the Sanballats and the Tobiahs in the church. You're going to run into them at the family gatherings. You may even run into them in your home today, in your workplace. And they're going to be there. And God's going to allow them to be there, because God is going to use them as his instruments to refine you, to shape and mold you, and make you more effective, more humble, more prayerful. They're going to be your thorns in the flesh. And Nehemiah here has his Sanballats and his Tobiahs. And it says, when they heard this, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, what is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Oh, this was the line they used before to block the work, that the Jews rebuilding the walls of the city would cause a rebellion, an insurrection. And they managed to persuade the king previously, the Persian king, to block this work on the basis that these Jews were rebellious people. And you know, no opportunity will ever come in the work of God without, alongside it, opposition. And I can say that with no fear of contradiction. No opportunity will ever come about without opportunity. And these are powerful people. Remember, Sanballat is the governor of Samaria. He's not an insignificant figure. And when he hears it, boy, he's angry. Now, how will Nehemiah respond? Verse 20. Then answered I Sometimes there comes a time when you have to speak, even to the enemies, lest that their words get a foothold and you have to face them down. And Nehemiah said to them and said, the God of heaven. Now notice where he puts the emphasis. He doesn't respond and mock them and say, who are you to talk to us? He knows who they are. He doesn't say, well, we're more powerful than you. It may well be that they're not. That Nehemiah and his people are much weaker than the governor of Samaria, Sanballat, and Tobiah, and all their cronies. So Nehemiah knows the way to respond to these people is not to fight fire with fire. It's not to boast in your strength versus their strength, but to do something where the whole equation will change, where you know that when you reveal this person and bring this person into the equation, they're finished, they're defeated. Because he says, the God of heaven, the God who made all things, the God who rules over all things, the God who sustains all things, he's on our side. And he's with us. So compared to him, you're nothing. That's really what he's saying. And he's not actually trying to change the minds of Sanballat and Tobiah, because he knows they're empowered by the devil. But what Nehemiah is doing in speaking like this, he's trying to strengthen and encourage his own people not to be shaken by the so-called strength of the opposition. He says, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. Oh, there's where our confidence is. Therefore, we, his servants, he puts himself in the right place. We are the servants of the Lord, but he's with us and he's watching over us. Will arise and build, but ye have no portion, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem. To both the people of God and to the enemies of the people of God, Nehemiah is consistent. No boasting in self. The focus is on God and God's glory. The focus is that God's in control and God's on their side. And the focus is we will serve the Lord. We'll rise up and build to honor him. And God has placed this responsibility, this charge upon us, and we're going to fulfill it. End of story. We're not going to be distracted. And what a leader Nehemiah was to his people. And what an example he is to us as we study this chapter. That, yes, you trust the sovereignty of God. Yes, you pray. Yes, you trust in God's power and for God's glory. But you also have to rise up and do God's work. And Nehemiah gets the balance of trusting in God's sovereignty and human responsibility as a child of God. He gets that balance, which is so hard to do. He gets it perfect. And it's no wonder he succeeds. And the lesson you and I have to learn this morning is this. Follow Nehemiah's example. Don't be rash. Don't rush into things. Pray, plan, but also act when God gives you the opportunity. And all throughout your time here on earth, don't seek to exalt self or even your circumstances. Because the moment you do that, you'll take your eyes off the one who you should be exalting, the one who you should be giving glory to, and then you'll be in trouble. And Nehemiah, what a man he was. What a leader of men he was. And what a successful leader and proponent of grace and faith and action this great man was. Learn from him. Be blessed. Be stirred by his example. And seek to live it in your home, in the workplace, and in the church of Jesus Christ. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for Nehemiah. What a man he was. What an example he was to his own people, but also to us in our generation. Help us to learn the lessons from his life and apply them to our own lives. For these things we ask in Jesus' precious name. Amen and amen.